Hello everyone and welcome to my first card spotlight video. This will be a new series that I start doing in the future, and it is a deep dive on the strengths and weaknesses of the card in question. We will even get to a few deck lists that utilize what we've learned along the way at the end of the video. So without further ado, let us get into breaking down Sarkhan the Masterless. Now, as you can see here, Sarkhan the Masterless is a 3 red, 5 loyalty planeswalker with +1 until end of turn. Each planeswalker you control becomes a 4/4 dragon with flying. -3, make 4/4 dragon token with flying, and a passive ability of whenever a creature attacks you or a planeswalker you control, each dragon you control deals damage to that creature. So this Sarkhan is finally free of Nicol Bolas's influence and is ready to have a pretty significant impact on Standard, I think. This card really exemplifies what you want in a mid-range card. It has the ability to be aggressive, it has the ability to be defensive based upon the context of the situation, and that's why I've chosen it as the first card I want to really break down, because of all the different applications it has. All of the abilities on this card have ways that you can synergize around them, but are powerful enough on the face of it that you don't have to do that. You can focus on one, not all of them. So in order to get into those specifics in detail, I've broken this video up into 3 main sections. First of which, going over the play patterns and general macro strategic elements surrounding the card, what situations you want to play it in, etc. How it lines up against other cards in the format, and what cards you want to play alongside it to synergize with it. So first, let's talk about what kind of game states Sarkhan's going to thrive in and which one he's not. So Sarkhan is a planeswalker, so obviously you are going to want to play it optimally on an empty board. Although Sarkhan does actually have a lot of defensive capabilities that allow him to be played into some number of creatures. There are a bunch of game states that really change Sarkhan's effectiveness depending upon what is on your opponent's side and what is on your side. Both matter. The game states you are trying to cultivate in order to maximize Sarkhan's effectiveness involve any of having some number of dragons on your side of the battlefield in order to leverage the passive, having some number of planeswalkers on your side in order to have an immediate impact to make them flyers right when it comes into play, get some haste damage in, or play Sarkhan into a board where the 4/4 and the passive trigger stymie their aggression, whatever the numbers would be on that, whether they have some 1/1s and a 3/3, etc. But in all of these cases, you really are incentivized to establish a board presence in the early turns of the game leading up to turn 5, mainly through creatures. You really want to be playing Sarkhan in a primarily proactive deck, and he's probably going to be the top or close to the top of your curve, because the play pattern you're trying to cultivate is play Sarkhan on a relatively safe board, minus get your dragon, untap, plus Sarkhan, and then attack for 8 in the air. And hopefully that 8 damage is representing lethal if you have spent the early turns pressuring your opponent in a significant way. Now, the worst case scenario for Sarkhan is if your opponent has some number of creatures in play, but creatures that the dragon and the trigger stymie, you play Sarkhan thinking he's going to be safe, and then your opponent plays Cast Down or some similar removal spell on the dragon, just gets to attack down Sarkhan, and you're essentially trading your 5-mana planeswalker with a 2-mana removal spell or something of the like. That's very, very bad. So you're really, again, trying to set up situations where that is not going to happen. And like we touched on earlier, the best way to do this is by spending the first 4 turns of the game being proactive, deploying threats to the battlefield. Because by doing this, you either put your opponent far enough on back foot where they can't afford to be aggressive against their planeswalker, they need to block, or you have forced them to expend all of their removal, leaving Sarkhan as your last threat, and he can pretty easily close the game out himself. So now that we have a fundamental strategic understanding of what kind of game states we're trying to cultivate with Sarkhan, let's delve into the kind of cards he's going to be played alongside and against, and how we can make it so he's always in a successful situation. So first, let's talk about matchups. What are some of the common cards that Sarkhan is going to be played against around the same mana cost? When you play Sarkhan, what's likely to be on the opposing side of the battlefield or threatening to come down the next turn from your opponent? Here are some common options that I believe Sarkhan lines up pretty well against. Pretty much all planeswalkers like Vivien Reid, Teferi, because Sarkhan creates multiple threats across 2 permanent types. So, for example, Vivien Reid and Teferi can't come in and minus on the dragon or Sarkhan because the other one would just attack and kill them. Similarly, Liliana Dreadhorde General can't be played into a Sarkhan because even if you plus it going to a Stout 7 loyalty, Sarkhan is threatening to attack for 8 in the air, just not even caring about the zombie chump blocker on the ground. That would normally be a very effective way to protect Liliana. That particular matchup, I think, is a big point in Sarkhan's favor because, as I'm probably going to talk about in a later video, Liliana Dreadhorde General is going to be the cornerstone of black mid-range decks moving forward, very Elspeth Sun's Champion-esque. So any card that lines up well against Liliana is going to have a solid spot in the format, and I believe Sarkhan is one of those cards. Now, some of the cards Sarkhan does not line up particularly well against are big, resilient flyers. Things like these: Skargan Hellkite, Rolesque, Rekindling Phoenix, Seraph of the Scales. These are all problematic for slightly different reasons. The big flyers, the 5+ toughness flyers, just completely stymie any offense you could put on. You're not going to be able to attack in Rolesque or a 5/5 Skargan Hellkite. The upside in those situations is that they can't really attack into you either, because the 4/4 dragon alongside the passive trigger actually does represent the ability to trade up with their 5-drop, something that's not particularly appealing to them. So while you are unable to attack, they're not able to either. You have a planeswalker in play, you can probably buy some time and dig yourself out of that. But one of the cards that's going to be consistently much more problematic is Rekindling Phoenix, and to a lesser extent, Seraph of the Scales. These cards just are very, very hard to deal with in creature combat, specifically Rekindling Phoenix. You're just not really going to win any battle involving creature combat with that card. You have to use a removal spell like Lava Coil, and I do think decks that are primarily focused around Sarkhan are going to bias heavily towards Lava Coil because of this. It's not as if that's a big ask. Lava Coil is already the best removal spell in red. You're likely going to be playing it anyway, but it's important to note the particular importance it has against Rekindling Phoenix, a card that would otherwise be incredibly problematic against Sarkhan. Another option you have to deal with these threats if you find yourself in green with Sarkhan is Forced Landing. Forced Landing is a very clean answer to all of the cards I just mentioned. It answers all of the big flyers, the resilient flyers, doesn't matter, it just takes care of everything. So definitely keep that in mind as a sideboard option if you are playing a Gruul-oriented Sarkhan deck. Another problematic card that is going to be pretty heavily played coming into War of the Spark Standard is Enter the God Eternals. It's one of the better cards against Sarkhan because it allows them to kill Sarkhan's Dragon Buddy and present a body that can then threaten to kill Sarkhan. You do get a turn to potentially deal with it, set up some defense, etc., but it does put you behind the 8-ball. The onus is on you to do something about it. Now, there are certain ways you can play around this. You can plus Sarkhan and just try and not present a good creature to hit, or put its loyalty high enough where the 4/4 attacker is not going to kill it, etc. But in most cases, your optimal play pattern is going to involve minusing Sarkhan on entry, and Enter the God Eternals is going to be a very effective way to punish that, so keep it in mind. So now that we have a better sense of what Sarkhan is going to be going up against, let's talk about what we want to put alongside Sarkhan in order to maximize his effectiveness. Now, the first card that comes to mind when we are trying to build a Sarkhan deck is Kiora Behemoth Beckoner. I think her and Sarkhan are pretty much inseparable. Like, quite literally, I have built a bunch of Sarkhan decks, and I have yet to come up with a compelling reason to not include Kiora in them. Because of Kiora's ability to be both green or blue, it really covers the spectrum of decks that you would want to play Sarkhan in, and it just lines up so perfectly well with what that card wants to do. I just haven't found a reason to not include it. Those things are Kiora's ability to ramp directly into Sarkhan from 3 to 5. You get a card off of the dragon token you make from Kiora's passive, and then if you untap with both, you get to plus Sarkhan. Kiora is a small, high loyalty planeswalker that's likely going to endure, increasing the effectiveness of Sarkhan's +1, and in the scenario I just mentioned, representing 12 damage in the air. That's a huge amount. So because of Kiora's ability to really provide incredibly powerful nut draws, and also just kind of being solid in general, I think she's going to be an exceptionally important part of most decks involving Sarkhan. Now, the next card has a bit of a history with Sarkhan. He may no longer be his master, but he's still going to probably be in the same deck as him a couple of times, is Bolas the Ravager. Bolas the Ravager is good alongside Sarkhan, obviously because it's a dragon, improving the quality of the passive ability, but more importantly, it is a 4-drop that taxes your opponent's removal, both in presenting a threat they're probably gonna have to deal with and forcing them to discard a card, really taxing their resources, increasing the likelihood that they're not going to be able to deal with Sarkhan on the follow-up turn. So if you're ever to play Bolas, force them to discard a card, play Sarkhan, make a dragon, not only are you incredibly heavily taxing your opponent's removal with all of these 2-for-1s, you also have an incredibly powerful defensive posture against all of the aggressive decks with 8 toughness worth of blockers and a pyroclasm from the passive ability if they would choose to attack, which they probably won't. And it's certainly worth mentioning the other 4-mana dragon, Varric's Bladewing, obviously much less powerful card than Bolas at 4 mana, doesn't have an Enters the Battlefield trigger, but when put in the context of the synergistic decks with Sarkhan and potentially 3 mana Sarkhan and Kiora and all these other effects, it may on the balance become good enough to include in a small number of copies just because of the ability to enable the curve I just mentioned with 4-mana dragon into Sarkhan, incredibly powerful defensive posture, and in the case of Varric's, the ability to kick it later in the game when you already have a Sarkhan, or when you lead up into developing a Sarkhan, creates an incredibly powerful defensive board presence that cracks back in the following turn for a large amount of damage. Now, another card that may get its own video down the road, is certainly worth mentioning, is Spark Double. Spark Double is a new clone effect from War of the Spark standard, but it is unique in its ability to create an additional copy of a legend or planeswalker. So something you are not normally capable of doing, you get to kind of abuse here with Spark Double, having 2 of the same planeswalker in play. So obviously that would lead you to consider planeswalkers with compounding effects, and Sarkhan is certainly one of them. If you have a Sarkhan in play, make a dragon and get to untap with it, you can then Spark Double the Sarkhan, make another dragon, and now anything that attacks you takes 4 damage, so you're likely just creating a moat. It's not really going to be viable for your opponent to attack you, and now you have 2 planeswalkers that can plus attack. The Spark Double one in particular can make another dragon because it comes into play with an additional loyalty counter, so there's a lot you can do from that point that's going to be very powerful. So I think it's more of a cute option than one that's especially competitive, but certainly something worth keeping your eye on if you're interested in playing with Sarkhan. Now, the last synergy I want to mention is Status Statue. We've seen Status Statue utilized alongside Goblin Chainwhirler, Skargan Hellkite in the big red decks that have a fairly solid pedigree of success in the format, and I think Sarkhan may be able to be utilized as another outlet for Status Statue, and just a card that's pretty on plan with what those decks are trying to do already, even absent any other dragon synergies, because you can use Sarkhan to apply pressure in that deck and just be a solid mid-range threat, but then you also have the backdoor synergy of another outlet for Status Statue, because if your opponent ever attacks into your Sarkhan while you have a dragon, you can, with the trigger on the stack, status your dragon because it is the one doing the damage from Sarkhan's passive trigger, and create your own makeshift Settle the Wreckage. So creating more targets in that deck for like Statue makes it so it's not as memey and actually close to just a very versatile and powerful card. So maybe Sarkhan is the like last straw that really makes it so, okay, we want to play like 4 status in that deck now. So we've mentioned several different cards that synergize very well with Sarkhan. We have a pretty good understanding of situations we're trying to cultivate and what it's going to be facing up against. So let's use all of that knowledge to make some deck lists and see what this would look like in practice. Now, the first deck list we have here is Grixis Dragon's Shell. This one has several cards we've mentioned so far in Kiora, Nicol Bolas, Varix Bladewings, being supported by a lot of cheap interaction. One of the strengths of Grixis is its ability to interact very cheaply through Lava Coil, Angrath's Rampage, and Thought Erasure. Lava Coil in particular, we mentioned the importance of against very problematic cards like Rekindling Phoenix. Thought Erasure also helps there. Now, this build is a bit creature light for what I talked about in the strategy section, where you want to really be deploying threats earlier in the game to clear the way for Sarkhan, but we are still being proactive just through different means. We are taxing their resources with Thought Erasure. We are playing other planeswalkers to accelerate into Sarkhan. We do have some dragons in the 4 spot to set up a board leading into Sarkhan's turn, even though we don't have that many. Soul Diviner is another card that is a reasonable blocker, but has some other synergy we'll talk about in a minute. So you are still being proactive, just not super proactive. This is about as slow a deck as I think you can play Sarkhan in, and I do still think it's reasonably powerful just because of the swings that Sarkhan generates. If you were able to take a defensive posture, protect Sarkhan for like a turn or 2, and then set up a really big crackback in the air, then that's a viable game plan that you can implement even though you're not being ostensibly aggressive. Now, it's possible, because this deck is on the slower end, you would want to play something like Cry of the Carnarium, Fiery Cannonade. Cry's a little bit harder than mana, you have to change stuff, but things of that nature that really insulate you from go wide decks, because I could certainly see this being vulnerable to that. That said, for this first preliminary build, I just wanted to flesh out the proactive core, and then once you have a better sense of what's going on in the format, you can obviously alter things in whichever way you see fit. And another cool element of this deck is we get the little Soul Diviner Kiora package, and to a lesser extent Sarkhan Fireblood, being able to turn the superfluous loyalty from these planeswalkers directly into cards. Kiora in particular has a preposterous amount of loyalty that is kind of bad later into the game. You're not really going to need to untap things unless you're untapping Soul Diviner to kind of chew through Kiora's excess loyalty. So if you're ever in a situation where you top deck a Kiora and you would otherwise be fairly bad, if you have a Soul Diviner in play, you can now immediately turn it into 2 cards, and that's a big deal, being able to get some velocity churn through your deck, making it so these cards that otherwise may be underwhelming moving into the late game are not. So this is a build that leans pretty heavily on Sarkhan's dragon-centric synergies, but you don't need to go in that direction. It's just a fairly powerful card, especially in regards to the swings it can generate, as we've talked about. So let's see what it looks like in a more aggressive shell. Now, this deck may look familiar to a lot of you. It is the normal core of a Gruul aggressive deck. We have changed some things around in order to support some new cards for more of the spark, the higher density of planeswalkers, including our boy Sarkhan and Domri, Anarch of Bolas, and Kiora. So this deck is much more looking to make it so by the time Sarkhan comes into play, and minuses and potentially pluses, that plus is representing lethal, because you're making another planeswalker an attacker, you've already been pressuring them with Gruul Spellbreakers or Ta Goblin, etc. So this build, Sarkhan's reach is the primary focus and what we're really looking to leverage. Domri, Anarch of Bolas is another particularly good one because it can ramp us directly into Sarkhan. It provides another cheap planeswalker that Sarkhan can turn into a dragon, and it is worth noting that Sarkhan's plus does not prevent planeswalkers from activating their loyalty abilities. I checked this. So you could potentially turn Domri into 4/4 dragon, and then have Domri have himself fight with something if they have like a 3/3 blocker in the way or whatever, and then you get to attack in the air with your guys. Now, granted, the dragon planeswalkers don't have indestructible or anything, so if like you attack your dragon planeswalker in a 4/4 and they just trade. So keep all that in mind when you're playing around with Sarkhan. There are some weird synergies, or weird interactions rather, regarding turning planeswalkers into creatures, but it should be pretty straightforward most of the time. And Domri's passive ability that gets retained while he is a dragon really does improve the burst damage potential you have, making that Kiora curve I mentioned before much more powerful, where you could Domri plus Sarkhan minus get a dragon and then attack for 15 on the following turn in the air. So that's an incredible amount of damage that you're able to represent on a fairly common curve, all things considered. Another card we get to incorporate from War is Evolution Sage, and with all of the riot triggers and loyalty counters we have, we're generally going to be getting a lot of value from the Proliferate trigger, whether that be from making our creatures larger, better able to fight with Domri, or additional fights with Domri, or additional dragons from Sarkhan. The only one where additional loyalty counters aren't particularly relevant is Kiora, but you still do get to untap things that could matter for pseudo-vigilance on creatures in racing situations, and she still does have a powerful passive effect that you do want to keep in play. So if her loyalty is high enough where your opponent just doesn't want to attack her, that's still valuable, being able to retain her passive in play, letting you get card advantage, keeping the gas coming. But these two decks just represent a starting point. I think these are the two primary paths you can take with Sarkhan, be it a slower red-blue shell, potentially moving into Grixis, or a faster green-red shell, potentially moving into other 3-color combinations. Whatever you do choose, I think that the skeletons provided in these decks are going to be something you see present throughout most of the builds that really make Sarkhan a powerful card. So I would certainly be interested in seeing other people's takes. Be sure to post your own builds of Sarkhan decks in the comment section, and I will get back to give my opinions on them, or you could just tell me how bad you think mine are. But in any case, I hope that you found this video helpful, and if you did, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, especially because we will be doing more of these. This will be part of a series moving into War Standard. We will be doing a bunch of these and other videos surrounding deck building or strategy, etc. Also, if you're interested in seeing me play any of the deck lists that have been shown here and others, stop by my Twitch channel at twitch.tv/TrueNFM. We will actually be playing War of the Spark this Tuesday in the early access event for streamers. So be sure to come by and check us out if you want to see War of the Spark in action a bit early. Thank you all for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you next time.